One of the most difficult things to grasp in MLB the Show 22 is how pitching works. First of all, you have your PAR, your perfect area region. This is where any perfect pitch can go. Thing is, what makes that bigger or smaller? What is every single factor in MLB the Show 22 that can affect the size of your PARs? Today, we're going to be going through and testing a lot of the things that can affect these PARs, whether it's attributes or the different inputs in your settings. This is a big factor of pitching because ideally you want smaller PARs, smaller areas, so you can aim more precisely with your pitches. So without further ado, let's go on into my test and see if we can come up to some good conclusions on how pitching mechanics work in this game. So first of all, what I want to do is quickly go into the in-game strategy guide and go through what MLB the Show has to say about the things that affect pitching control. First of all, your input is a factor. So if you're someone who is using meter, pure analog, pinpoint, these have different sizes for your perfect accuracy regions. So for example, pinpoint, since it's a harder input, has a smaller PAR in comparison to pure analog, which is a little bit of an easier input. You got to make sure you have the right setting. We're going to test this ourselves and see how much it actually does. Second of all, there are in-game things that actually change things. So they mention here on the bottom, confidence is also a factor along with energy. So if a pitcher is low energy in the game, it'll actually reduce their ability to control pitches. So like what it'll do, it'll like tinker with the walks per nine attribute, the BB per nine. It'll tinker with that and basically make the walks per nine bigger and make it more difficult for the pitcher to locate. So as you see on the bottom, confidence, the factor that it has is that it negates the fatigue factor more. So if you are pitching very well and late into a game with a starter, you know, those pitchers can last long in the game. So what confidence does, it kind of counters that effect of walks per nine as you get lower and lower and lower in the energy. It also says it has the smallest influence on all pitcher attributes, walks per nine's control, fatigue. Point is, it seems like confidence does tinker with some things as well. And this little paragraph is going to be the big thing I want to focus on today. The two most important attributes that influence pitch accuracy are BB per nine, walks per nine innings, and the individual pitch accuracy for the selected pitch. Certain pitch types such as fastballs are in general more accurate than other curveball, for example. We want to look at these attributes and see if walks per nine and individual control on pitches actually are a factor. And I tried to test a couple things. I got some screenshots of the size of the perfect area regions from changing these things. Little bit of gameplay throwing a bunch of pitches with them, and kind of want to describe my experiences with that because part of it might be a feel thing. Like you might not actually be able to tell based on just throwing some pitches. You might have to feel out the difference between different attributes and different things changing. So I want to go through my quick process and what exactly I did so we could make this easy to understand. What I did was I went into the offline rosters. I used Corbin Burnes as my test dummy, partially because he has sinker, cutter, you know, popular pitch mix. But also he has outlier on the sinker. And outlier is also another one of those things that affects the size of your perfect area regions. So what I did was I went into roster control, edit player, and then went to Corbin Burnes and basically just took his attributes, boosted them all to 99. Took a bunch of screenshots of the size of the perfect area regions as like a base point. This is what we're going to compare everything to. And what we will do is actually lower the attributes of the one thing at a time and see what actually changes. So first, I'll lower the walks per nine, then the control, then velocity, then break. And I took all screenshots on Photoshop and I basically colored in with the circle tool on there the exact size of the PAR, and we're going to compare it to this baseline version and see if we could see exactly what tinkering with each attribute does so we get an understanding of how perfect accuracy regions work. All right, here is our handy dandy Photoshop tool. I have a bunch of screenshots and stuff to go through on here and what I tested. All of this was done in custom practice. And I tried to test multiple pitches, pitch locations, so I could try to display these different things. So at this point, every single pitch has 99 velocity, 99 break, 99 control, and all of Corbin Burnes' attributes are boosted. So first I want to talk about the per pitch effect, because it's definitely a thing based on pitches. As you see, I'm aiming all these pitches on the bottom left corner. The fastball pitches, the cutter, and the sinker are definitely a little bit more accurate. But the thing is, Corbin Burnes, first of all, has outlier on the sinker, so that there's an additional extra penalty on outlier. That was a big change they made this year. So if a pitcher has outlier on a fastball, they'll get even more of a penalty, getting that par a little bit bigger. So as you see, these are both going to be some of the more accurate pitches. But you see the sinker with 99 control and 99 walks per nine still has a pretty big par here on all-star difficulty. The circle change, you see it's definitely more difficult to control. Same with the curveball and the sliders. So the breaking balls have slightly bigger pars than the other fastballs because by nature, like they say in the strategy guide, fastballs are easier to control. Second of all, you can't really see it on here. I will play a clip on here. So when you have sinkers and breaking balls, any pitch that is meant to be thrown on the lower half of the zone, if you slightly move your aim indicator up at all, then the par will get bigger. So if you try to throw a high sinker or anything really above the middle part of the zone, it'll end up with those pars being bigger because sinkers, changeup stuff, they're trying to counter those pitches from being able to be located high in the zone. So they make the pars bigger based off of that. It's a gradual thing the more you slightly move the stick up. So I noticed, just as a general baseline, if you don't touch the left indicator at all, then anything that you do the move straight left, straight right, straight down will not get any bigger. But the second you move your stick slightly up, no matter where the original indicator is, it'll make that par start to be bigger. So at least what I would theorize, if you have a pitch with lower break, it doesn't have as much downward movement, you might be able to get away with throwing it higher more because the pitch actually starts closer to the center, so you'll have less of a punishment for throwing up, if you're trying to get what I mean. But again, I don't think this is really the biggest factor. I don't think you should want to use a low break pitch. There are a lot of other factors that affect the size of your pars, which we're going to go into now. So first, I wanted to test walks per nine. They mentioned in that strategy guide how walks per nine is a factor. So I want to start off there and test our walks per nine. So here it is, pitch by pitch. I took screenshots, as you see, with these pars. You could already see a difference if you were just looking at these screenshots. But first, this is the comparison between our two cutters. So throwing a cutter with 50 walks per nine instead of 99 walks per nine. Just the difference in between that, you see that there is a significant jump in the size of the par. Probably like 50% bigger. You see with the cutter, already a difference. The sinker being the blue, you can see again, it's bigger. Circle change, again, the blue zone is bigger than the red. Same with the curveball, again, slightly bigger. And then finally, slider, you see, again, it's bigger. I've heard people theorize with walks per nine that it affected, like if you're aiming at the corner of the zone, is there a higher likelihood of that pitch ending up outside of the zone? If you got a perfect pitch, like we'll end up in the ball side of the par more likely or not. From my experience, I didn't really feel that in my test. However, what I definitely noticed, obviously, was the different sized par. It's significantly bigger with a lower walks per nine. Next, we have our control rating. You would think each individual pitch control would affect the size of your par. These pitches are the exact same size par-wise. So first, we're gonna start off with the cutter. As you see, the green is the exact same size as the red. Sinker, exact same size as the red. These are screenshots where all I did was I moved that walks per nine back to 99. So everything was 99 except for each individual's pitch control rating, which was at 50. So if you notice, the pars are exactly the same. And I know what you may be thinking. Scann, is this even useful? Like, does this mean that control is a useless attribute? And I really don't know. Like, I feel like from what I was doing in my practicing here, if there was a pitch with the lower control pitcher that wasn't perfect input, it felt like that ball was going a lot more often across the strike zone, you know, very, very far from where I originally aimed it. That is what it felt like. But I really don't know. I don't know if the control rating actually is something that is effective of where the pitches go, or if it's something where if you use classic pitching, then that's the only time where it kind of rewards you, because you know what classic pitching is. It's taking all the input out of your hands and is going off of randomness. So I really don't know what control does. From looking at this, there's zero effect on the par. We can confirm that, and it's tough to tell what the heck it does. Next, we have velocity. And in theory, with how MLB the Show does things, a pitcher who is throwing slower would have more control of that pitch, because they aren't really throwing as hard, not really focused on getting all their energy into the pitch, not trying to gas people away. So this game tries to counter velocity with control. What I did is I lowered every individual pitch velocity rating. So as you see here, when I lower the velocity rating, I adjusted the cutter. I lowered the velocity to 50. I did this with the other pitches as well, and I noticed a similar thing. Pars definitely got significantly smaller with the lower velocity for the cutter. So when I changed the velocity from 99 to 50 on this cutter, the normal speed of the cutter originally was like 97 miles an hour. When I have the velocity set to 50, this is the difference between a 97 and an 88 mile per hour cutter. The point is, 88 mile per hour cutter, that's very reasonable. That's where a lot of pitchers are throwing their cutters. You usually aren't throwing them super quick. With this rating, it's definitely dependent on the pitch. You could be more than fine having a lower velocity, better control cutter. But here's the thing that's a little backwards. So with the fastballs, the sinkers, the cutters, I noticed this exact same trend where pars got smaller. It makes sense, right? Not throwing a fastball as hard, you have an easier ability to control it. Fine. However, notice when I go to the circle change here, when I lower the velocity rating, as you see, it gets faster. I don't get that. So the higher the velocity, the slower the pitch is. This is a lower velocity rating circle change overlaid with a higher velocity rating circle change. So emphasis, the rating. For some reason, the higher the velocity on the circle change, the slower it's thrown. So for some reason, it's backwards on some of these breaking balls. And I gotta actually test and see how many pitches there are. If I test it, I'll list all the pitches that it is this way with. It's backwards. Higher velocity means you throw slower, and it's harder to control, apparently. Since this velocity rating is backwards for some reason, I don't know why it is this way with a circle change. The higher the velocity rating, the slower the pitch goes. The slower the circle change, the harder it is to control, which really doesn't make much sense. So as you see thus far, walks per 9 and velocity are the big two things that affect the size of a par. Control didn't really do too much. It was kind of perplexing, kind of confusing. Again, wasn't really entirely sure. I felt like control, if it did anything, required a lot of sample of pitching. I need to pitch a lot, and I need to see how many pitches end up in or out of the par, in the center of the par, and it's very, very difficult to test. However, from what I felt, I really didn't feel much, unfortunately, which is genuinely confusing. And I did some final testing of just some of the other basic attributes, just to quickly see if there is a difference. I'll go through them very quickly on the overlay here. I tested lowering the hits per 9. Hits per 9 is supposed to make your opponent's PCI smaller, the inner PCI that is. Lower hits per 9 didn't do anything to the size of the par. Lower homers per 9. Homer per 9 doesn't affect anything online. However, offline, it affects how hard your opponents hit the ball. As you see, low homers per 9, basically the exact same size par. Ks per 9 is supposed to affect the outer PCI, inducing less foul balls and more strikeouts, kept the par the same size as well. And then finally, lowering the break. So when I lowered the break of the pitches, how much it affect the par, break didn't seem to affect anything from what I saw. However, what I noticed when I was pitching with the low break pitches, since the pitches obviously are moving at 50 break instead of 99, it seemed like a lot of the pitches were ending up in similar parts of the zone more often than the high break stuff. Like when I was trying to locate the high break sliders and curveballs, they had a lot more variation in where they were going when I wasn't throwing perfects. But for some reason, they were ending up in that same quarter of the zone more often on non-perfects. So I don't know if it's because the pitches don't have much break and it's just dependent on the pitch break and how wild a pitch can be. Not really sure. And last, I want to test our different inputs just to kind of re-emphasize how, pinpoint is going to be the most rewarding pitching input for you to use, because it does keep your pars the smallest. It is the most difficult to get down, but I want to see if there's a big difference between the inputs and see if it's really worth using one over the other. So this is Pulse. This is the same cutter on Pulse pitching overlaid with the original pinpoint pitching cutter. And as you see, there's definitely a sizable difference with using Pulse. I mean, Pulse is a lot simpler of an input. I don't know if this is really worth it. Like, look at how much bigger that par is, you know? Like, how easy is it to actually locate with pitchers like this. This is meter, and I was actually astonished at how basically similar meter input and pinpoint input are. Like, on this cutter, it was basically the exact same. I probably could test with more pitches, but you see, meter is going to be the closest to giving you pinpoint type accuracy, and it's really interesting because I feel like meter isn't like too hard to do. So I don't know, maybe it's hard to get a perfect on meter. I don't really know what's up with that. And then finally, this is pure analog. So pure analog is kind of in between meter and pulse. It's, again, kind of not rewarding because of how much bigger it makes your pars. At the end of the day, if you really struggle with one input, just use what's most comfortable to you. But finally, I want to hop onto Diamond Dynasty and look at some cards that I think are going to be the best control pitchers in the game, and go through some of the more popular card choices in the game and try to explain why they do or don't have great control based on the things that we found. First, Randy Johnson. Obviously, Randy Johnson is a high velocity pitcher. He has outlier. He's got a pretty high velocity slider. However, you know, his control is going to be incredible because at parallel 5, he has 84 walks per 9. He also has, you know, I don't know if the control ratings do crap, but, you know, I guess it could be a factor. And he's throwing very hard on a lot of these pitches. So Randy has pretty solid control, but he's definitely more of a stuff pitcher. You're using him because of the velocity, the break, and all of that. Corbin Burns' All-Star Game card should actually be pretty respectable on the control side of things with 87 walks per 9. But again, he's going to be hurt with the velocity. This card has pretty good velocity on the sinker and the cutter, so he's not going to be able to precisely locate every single one of those pitches because he's got basically maxed out velo on those pitches. Brandon Webb here should at least be pretty good in the control front because he has lower velocity, not super low, but also paired with 103 walks per 9. This would really scream to be a control precise dot type pitcher. But obviously people don't love Brandon Webb because he doesn't really have that much horizontal movement. If he had like a slider or something, he could be a little bit more interesting, and his hits per 9 is a little bit low. Mike Mussina, parallel 5, has 106 walks per 9, and obviously the hits per 9 is a little bit low. Your opponent is slightly bigger PCIs, and he doesn't have the most velocity. But again, someone like Mussina is a pretty solid control type pitcher if you want to aim your pitches properly. Greg Maddux, you would think, is like the control pitcher. And I think he really is actually like the guy because of how slow he throws. He's got 89 and 90 on the sinker and cutter. Those two pitches, very slow. And that paired with the 95 walks per 9. And I don't know if the control helps much, but if it does, I mean, this card does scream like the control precise dot pitcher in the game. And I've actually had a lot of fun using him. And last but definitely not least, Dallas Keuchel. He gets 95 walks per 9 at parallel 5. Again, he has pretty good control ratings, but again, he doesn't throw hard. 75 velocity, the sinker at 91, the cutter at 89. He's at that like threshold where he's got good control because he's not throwing hard. Point I want to make is keep an eye out not only on the individual control and pitches. I know a lot of people would see this, the control rating and walks per 9, and think, oh, this card could be elite. But you got to keep an eye out on the individual pitch velocities to gauge control. For example, Shohei Ohtani should have respectable control on that cutter, despite him not having, you know, the best walks per 9. The velocity being, you know, 90 miles an hour should make him a pretty solid control with that cutter. If you have not used the 90 overall Devin Williams with an 83 mile per hour cutter, this pitcher, I mean, he's got basically the lowest velocity on a cutter you can get. So it's obviously a little bit countered by his 65 walks per 9, but some of the really slow cutter like this could basically dot it. Jared Weaver here should be a good example of someone that can locate well with the breaking stuff, mainly the slider and the changeup. I haven't used this card much, but I've got a hunch that those pitches in the 12-6 have pretty good control because of how slow he's throwing them. And finally, I want to show you an example of a card that honestly should be a control pitcher, but really isn't based off of the attributes and what we learned today. Orel Hershiser here, you know, he's got pretty okay velocity, you know, 89's on the cutter, 92 on the sinker. It's like good. But on the faster end of things with the sinker, you would think with 90 and 85 control, he'd be respectable, but the 71 walks per 9 hurts the card, makes the par bigger, and the ball seems to be a little bit more wild to this man. I had like 1 or 2 good starts to them, and then I had 1 or 2 very bad ones. I'm surprised the ERA is 2.45. And I almost forgot to talk about Joe MANTIPLY, because this card should be like the control guy with 125 walks per 9. But you know, he's got a slow curveball, slow circle change. Not super slow though. But that 125 walks per 9 should really, really help him in hitting those spots. So when I've used this card, he's definitely a really good control pitcher. And that walks per 9 definitely is a big factor for it. So yeah, that's my little deep dive on pitching attributes and all the things that can affect pitching control. I've got to do some more testing and understanding on how those individual control ratings work. But from what I've found, you got to be keeping an eye on walks per 9 and velocity when trying to decide the pitcher's control. High speed fastballs is valuable for, you know, getting late swings and really messing with people's timing. So these are all different things you got to trade off. However, walks per 9 is definitely like a thing you definitely want. I appreciate you all watching. Make sure you like this video if you enjoyed. Make sure you check out my other deep dives that I've done on MLB the Show 22. I appreciate you all watching this video, and I will see you all again on hopefully a 99 Andrew McCutchen debut tomorrow. Deuces.